Hello, my name is Donovan, and I'll be interviewing the Gulf War soldier Robert McBride. This interview was conducted by someone else and I downloaded it. Therefore, I will only take credit for the video and the multiple minor edits to this text. Also, I chose my favorite questions from the interview. But let's get into the actual interview. I grew up in a town out in the west side of Texas called Rosto. I was the son of a World War II infantryman. My father was in the Pacific War. Sadly, he's no longer here. I would like to hear his stories in the war, but he died when I was only 13 years old. I graduated from school in the year 1987. There was not much going on around here and the military was my way out. Was your father's service an inspiration for you in choosing the military? Oh yes. When I was hanging out with my father at his station, a lot of old soldiers would come and talk, and I would listen. And when we would go to the American Legion and VFW sometimes and listen to those vets and hear their stories. They were my heroes, and it was interesting for me to hear their adventures in the war and the places they'd gone to. So yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your drill instructors and your training. I'll tell you, the drill sergeant I remember the most was Sergeant Zuniga. I think he was from Ecuador. I remember I couldn't understand a word that guy was saying. I grew up with a big Mexican population around my hometown, but he had a heavy accent I could not understand.
72 hours, 5 colonies have experienced identical events.
I remember, he was not a nice man.
Massive destruction, forerunner and origin.
And until we had our mid-cycle pass. At that time infantrymen were still doing one-station unit training.
But Dr. Catherine Elizabeth Halsey has managed to contact
And in between basic training and AIT, which is what the rest of the army called it.
us. She claims to have information on these attacks.
They gave us a pass in Columbus and we went downtown and rented us a hotel room and kicked back and drank some beer. And Sergeant Zuniga showed up at the hotel. And we thought, oh my god, we're gonna die. But instead he joined us and had some beverages with us.
Your mission is to
Of course there was a complete 100% rollover. So when he got back the next day, he was still like the Antichrist. But it was a good experience. I enjoyed it. Looking back, at the time it was terrible. At one point, almost half the people dropped out because of heat exhaustion. We went to a map reading class. One of the instructors was quite boring. He had that very monotone instructor voice, and put most of us to sleep, which didn't sit well with the drill sergeants. And when we got back to the campsite, they almost physically trained us to death, and a few of us went to the hospital. Well, that sounds pretty bad. Yes, looking back, and after being a drill sergeant, I realize now that they were wrong on that, but that was a memorable event. That was in a little book. A guy named George C. Wilson wrote a book about it. It was called Mud Soldiers. He followed us through our basic training and wrote a story about life inside the new volunteer army. Interesting. So you had that happen. How long was your training? Was it about 12 weeks? 13 weeks for infantry school. And what would you say the army was like in 1987? In 1987, it was an interesting place, as the military always is. It's in a constant state of evolution. At that point, we weren't an army at war. We had the Cold War going on. There weren't a lot of bullets flying everywhere. The Russians were the bad guys. We trained against Soviet doctrine constantly. It was all about the Soviets. All about the Soviets. And one of the big blessings for me later on in my career, and I didn't realize it until later in my career, we still had a fairly large amount of Vietnam-era veterans in the army that were in the senior non-commissioned officer and senior officer positions. You really paid attention to those guys. They could really shape you for the type of conflicts that we encountered later on in the War on Terror.